Yeah, whenever you're all ready, then you can proceed.
Now I'm ready.
Okay. No, good luck, Ntate Mate.
Thank you very much, Ntate Madiope, for giving me this opportunity to introduce to our beloved students the learning theories for inclusive teaching. This is our lesson presentation, number 1, which is presented by Dr. Maite E Maebana, module code INC4802. The lesson for today is structured as follows. We will have the introduction, the policies related to the implementation of inclusive education, learning theories for inclusive teaching, which are as follows. The theory of inclusive education, or the theory of inclusive special education, the critical disability theory, human rights theory, inclusive pedagogy, the capability approach, social construction theory, and the indigenous knowledge system and African pedagogy. Followed by developing your practice theory, and lastly, we will have summary and conclusion. This is our learning unit number 1. And when you have listened, or when you shall have listened to this lesson, you should be able to critically evaluate a range of learning theories applicable to the implementation of inclusive teaching and learning. In addition, you should be able to describe how each theory will influence your teaching practice in your inclusive classroom and reflect on your own practice of inclusion in your classroom. Without any waste of time, let's introduce our lesson. We're finding out that definitions of inclusive education will be presented as follows. It is advisable to note that there is no single universally accepted definition of inclusion. This is attributed to the conceptual difficulties in defining the philosophy, including what counts to be as evidence of its practice and model practice. This was obtained from Florian, 2012. Considering the definition of inclusion, inclusion is about the community. And inclusion is a dynamic process. When we say this is a dynamic process, it would mean that this process is continuous in nature. It keeps on changing from time to time. Inclusion or inclusive education refers to the restructuring of social and, by implication, educational settings in order to meet the needs of all learners, irrespective of their status of disability or any trajectories. As we proceed, we're saying inclusive education constitute a radical paradigm shift. And in continuation, we're saying inclusive education is a policy priority as encapsulated in international and Southern African legal frameworks, including the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs. As we proceed, we will be looking at the White Paper 6 on Special Needs. No. We will be looking at White Paper 6 on Special Needs Education, Building an Inclusive Education and Training System of 2001. As a result, many learners with special needs or who experience barriers to learning are being enrolled. Just a minute. Ntate Madiope, can't you just remove this screen from my content?
King Jamil.
No, I see Jamie, the black spot hide my information. Can we put it at the far corner, the right far corner? The screen. The screen.
Screen sang sa se bontshang nna or se bontshang wena?
Se bontshang nna.
Oh yeah, I think let me see. Saushira ne?
Yeah. It's hiding my information.
O se drag, how can us drag or Sahano drag.
Yes.
And funny enough, on my side, class. I think what we can do. Okay, wait. Hoka ya mo di optioning. Are ke bone mo the side thing more na leng. Like you want an option, and then how team yone ba bang, because onale button engwe bana motho kwa yone, it should be saying minimize content.
Okay.
And then the other one it'll focus on content.
Good. No, it's fine now.
It's sharp or no?
Can you see my presentation?
Yeah, introduction again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are now on the third definition, where we will be looking at the inclusive education, where we're saying inclusive education constitutes a radical paradigm shift and by no means should be considered a linear progression from a special need approach. And this has been obtained from the work of Liasido 2015, page 5. As we proceed, we say inclusive education is a policy priority as encapsulated in international and Southern African legal frameworks, including the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs. That is from UNESCO 1994. In addition, we're saying the White Paper 6 on Special Needs Education, where it indicates that building an inclusive education and training system of 2001, as a result, many learners with special needs or experience barriers to learning are being enrolled. And the consolidated report on the implementation of inclusive education, however, revealed that many learners are still experiencing exclusion. That is, many learners are still not being accommodated in the mainstream education. In summary, we say inclusion is about increasing the participation of all learners in reducing their exclusion from their cultures, curricula, and communities of local schools. And inclusion is concerned with the learning and participation of all learners vulnerable to exclusionary pressures, not only those with disabilities or those categorized as experiencing learning barriers and development. It is concerned with the improvement of staff as well as learners. And in a nutshell, inclusion is about acknowledging that all learners have a right to education in their local communities. And inclusion is concerned with fostering mutually sustaining relationships between schools as well as communities. Then now we are going to look at the policies that are related to the implementation of inclusive education. We have got a lot of policies in South Africa, but some of these policies are not implemented. But now we are going to focus on a number of policies, as we usually indicate that South Africa as a country has a lot of policies around the world, but some of the policies are not implemented. And this focus, or this module, focuses mainly on South African policies related to inclusive education. Then we are going to look at the following. That is the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And according to this policy, the aim is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote as well as to respect their inherent dignity. And the second policy, that is the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of 2006, especially Article number 24. And according to this policy, it states that state parties shall ensure that persons with disabilities are able to access general, tertiary education, vocational training, adult education, as well as lifelong learning without any form of discriminatory practices on an equal basis with others. That is what is contained in the article number 24. The third one, that is the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of 1989, with special reference to article number 23. And according to this policy, it states that the state will recognize all mentally or physically disabled children and should ensure that they should enjoy a full and decent life in conditions which ensure dignity, which ensure promotion of self-reliance and facilitation of the child's active participation in the community. That is article number 23. And the fourth one, that is the Education White Paper 6 on Special Needs Education, where it is building an inclusive education and training system of 2001. This paper outlines how education and training system must transform itself to contribute to establishing a caring and humane society, how it must change to accommodate the full range of learning needs, and then mechanisms that should be put in place. And as we proceed, we're looking at the policy on screening, identification, assessment, and support. So the purpose of this policy is to provide a policy framework for the standardization of the procedures to identify, assess, and provide program for all learners who require additional support to enhance their participation and inclusion in schools. We are aware that all learners are not equal. All learners are not identical. And all learners, they learn through their own pace. And their own pace of learning or their individual paces of learning should be taken into consideration. And the CS policy is aimed at improving access to quality education for vulnerable learners and those who experience barriers to learning, including learners in mainstream schools who are failing to learn due to barriers of whatever nature. The nature might be emanating from family disruptions, language issues, poverty, learning difficulties, or any other form of disability. Therefore, learners with disabilities in special schools, where disability could act as a barrier to their learning, and children of compulsory school going age and youth who may be out of school or have never enrolled in a school due to their disability and other related barriers. And we're finding out that the main focus of the policy is to manage and support teaching and learning processes for learners who experience barriers to learning within the framework of the National Curriculum Statement, which starts or which begins from grade R up to grade 12. In addition, we have got the Constitution of South Africa, Act number 108 of 1996, the South African School Act of 84, Act number 84 of 1999, the Education White Paper 5 on Early Childhood Development of 2001, the Children's Act number 38 of 2005, the Curriculum and Assessment Policy Statement, which starts from grade R up to grade 12 of 2001, the HIV and AIDS in Education Policy of 1999, the Integrated School Health Policy of 2012, and many more policies. And we have got challenges that teachers in the schools experiences. We're saying teachers are confronted with many challenges in teaching and managing social and behavioral development while ensuring academic success of all learners. Recent research has found that learners with diverse needs are far more likely to be socially excluded at school compared to other peers, according to Lindsay et al. 2014. And we acknowledge that the inclusion of children with diverse learning needs is one of the most complex and poorly understood areas of education. Therefore, classroom teachers in particular face many challenges, including learners with disabilities alongside their typically developing peers. It is therefore important to understand the range of teaching strategies used to successfully include children with disabilities within mainstream classes. And this is the focus of this module. We are now going to look at the first theory. As we have already indicated, we're saying theory of inclusive special education. According to Hornby 2015, Hornby 2015 introduced a new theory for the education of learners with special education needs as well as disabilities. And this was prompted by his belief that inclusive education and special education are based on different philosophies that provide conflicting views and approaches on how best to educate the learners with special needs and disabilities. Consequently, the theory of inclusive special education attempts to synthesize the opposing philosophies, values, and practices of inclusive education by merging them with interventions, strategies, and procedures commonly applied to special education. The theory of inclusive special education, therefore, aims to guide the development of policies, procedures, as well as teaching strategies that are appropriate for all learners with special needs and disabilities. And for further readings, you may consult Hornby G 2015, titled Inclusive Special Education, Development of New Theory for the Education of Children with Special Needs and Disabilities, obtained from the British Journal of Special Education. And we get into the second one, that is the critical disability theory. So we're saying critical disability theory symbolizes a change from disability and disablement. For an example, albinism. In this way, the theory tries to empower the powerless and transform the prevailing social injustices and inequalities, as well as the discrimination and social exclusion. So critical disability theory is derived from the critical social theory first outlined by Max Horkheimer, which has today become a diverse family of critical theories which offer various approaches to social inquiry. A critical jurisprudence of disability identifies the sources of oppression within the law and legal institution, and by means of that exposure seeks to relieve disabled person from that oppression and identifies the potentially positive role of law and seeks to create law, use existing law, and enlist legal institutions in the struggle for the emancipation of disabled people, which is the rationale for critical disability theory itself. And the human rights theory Inclusion is regarded as a human right issue, since its diversity is a norm, as well as positive and enriching. All learners are viewed as equal valued members of society who are entitled to an education. Therefore, inclusive education is associated with equity and social justice and a human rights approach to social relations. In the classroom context, all learners enjoy acceptance, tolerance, respect, and the celebration of diversity. According to the Salamanca Statement of 1994, it placed the obligation on the state to protect and enhance the rights of disabled learners. And the declaration proclaims the fundamental rights of every child to access education in mainstream inclusive schools. It clearly states that inclusion and participation are essential to human dignity and to the enjoyment and exercise of human rights. And segregation and discriminatory practices are regarded as a violation of human rights. So now, as teachers of tomorrow, we are found wanting in terms of having, or in terms of putting discriminatory attitudes towards our fellow learners. And by so doing, we will be violating their rights to learn. Learners who experience barriers to learning or who are disabled should not be educated in special schools. And some proponents of this theory advocate for the abolition of special schools. And others believe that special schools have no place within the rights-based framework. Note that in the South African education system, there is no room for special schools as well as full service schools. And the main aim of human rights approach to education is to accommodate learners' diversity in the socially just and democratic ways. And this necessitates celebrating differences, recognizing and accommodating individual needs, and removing all forms of oppression. And for further reading, you may consult Pentic N, as well as L'Oreal L 2015, Developing Teachers as Agents of Inclusive or of Inclusion and Social Justice. And let's look at the inclusive pedagogy. We say classroom teachers are increasingly being confronted by learners with diverse needs. And this is a fundamental truth. Therefore, inclusive education has resulted in learners with special needs being educated in mainstream settings. Teachers, therefore, need inclusive pedagogy or an inclusive pedagogical approach to make the best use of what they already know when learners experience difficulties. And this can only be possible if teachers can be in a position to extend what is usually available as part of the classroom routine to respond to learners' diverse needs. In addition, teachers should be in a position to shift teaching and learning from what works for the most learners, alongside something additional for some learners who experience difficulties. And shifting the teacher's thinking from and some to everyone, and developing a greater awareness and understanding of the educational and social conditions that can influence children's learning, and equipping teachers with strategies to support learners and respond to their difficulties appropriately. And the capability approach. The 4 principles of capability approach include equal participation, which includes resources, agency, recognition, and practical reasoning. And according to inclusive pedagogy, schools need to be made pedagogical, individual, and institutional arrangements that enable equal participation for all learners. And as we proceed, we're finding out that educational processes are employed for the purpose of expanding human capability, and the emphasis is placed on democratic values in a fair, well-functioning society, and all human beings are viewed as having the right of choice in determining their life trajectories, and all human beings should be provided with tools that allow them to realize their potential. And democratic values are particularly important for the creation of context, and individuals should be willing and able to strive towards their possibilities. And we're finding out that the praxis plays a central role in education, and evaluating human well-being, equality, freedom, and rights are seen as the central features. As we proceed, we're saying capabilities are opportunities of freedom to evaluate the achievements of all learners. We are aware that all learners can learn and achieve, but their process of learning is different from one another. That is why we're saying all learners can learn and achieve, but they learn differently, as well as their achievements differ substantially from one another. That is why we have got the slower learners, the average learners, and those who are highly gifted. It determines the types of desirable conditions which can be created for learners to achieve an appropriate outcome, and how the resources like curriculum, pedagogy, and learning materials can be redistributed to achieve the outcome. It determines the kind of inputs, the ideas, the teachers, and learning materials that will shape particular opportunities to achieve desired outcomes. That is, outcomes such as economic growth, as well as social solidarity. And the focus is on learning, which strengthens the capacities of learners to act progressively on their own behalf through the acquisition of relevant knowledge, useful skills, and appropriate attitude, so that learners can in turn create places of safety, security, and healthy interactions. Read the following article that is available on the e-recepts. And this article is from Norwich B of 2013, titled, "How Does the Capability Theory Address the Current Issues in Special Education Needs, Disabilities, and Inclusive Education Field?" That is the Journal of Research in Special Education Needs. As you read, pay special attention to what the capability approach has to offer inclusive education. And the following questions are posed. Can the capability approach replace the language of needs and rights? And can the capability approach deal with the key issues in the fields of disability and difficulties in education? These are the questions which you need to consider when you will be trying by all means to read this article. In continuation, it is possible, or is it possible, to prevent the capability approach from becoming a promising trend that ends in disappointment? The last question, it is concluded that there needs to be an awareness of its completeness. Therefore, it needs to be integrated with other approaches. Nevertheless, it is argued that the capability approach and some conceptual resources to re-examine issues in the disability and education field. So now, as you will be trying by all means to read this article, consider those questions and make your own notes and summaries. And now we get into the social constructivist theory. The social constructivist theory is an extension of constructivism into social settings. We're finding out that groups construct knowledge for one another, as they will be working hand in hand with one another. And in this way, they create shared artifacts with shared meanings. And when one is immersed within a culture in this way, one is learning all the time how to be part of that culture. We know very well that South Africa is a multicultural country, and we often learn from one nation. We construct knowledge socially through interaction with one another. Who we are. Na kirinabuma. And what we know. Na ritzvang. Has been shaped by experiences and interactions. As we interact with one another, learning occurs because our schemata incorporate new knowledge. Then this leads us to the models of development, with special reference to individual development in social context. The following section delineates the theoretical framework and underlying models related to development in general and social emotional development in particular. We're saying various theoretical frameworks have been articulated that emphasize the mutual reciprocity between the learner and the environment. Therefore, theories of human development, such as ecological theory of Bronfenbrenner of 1979, or the socio-ecological theory of Vygotsky, 1975, developed from the notion that cognition, what an individual perceives and learns, is an integral part of the immediate context, as well as related context, and of the social and historical context that influence current interactions and ways of understanding. And the last theory, that is the indigenous knowledge system and African pedagogy. It is a knowledge system grounded on indigenous and local knowledge experiences culture, and historical heritage of the African people. So as we proceed, we're saying contemporary South African policies on the implementation of inclusive education emphasizes a sociological, community-based system of education. And we're saying contemporary South African policies on the implementation of inclusive education emphasizes a sociological community based on collaborative approach to learning support. And moreover, contextual factors and influences are investigated and considered for learners who experience barriers to learning. Inclusive education is grounded in the bioecological system of Bronfenbrenner, which emphasizes that there is a complexity of influences, interactions, and relationships between the learners and the multiple other systems. In order to provide holistic support within a social ecological approach to inclusive education, as opposed to providing individualistic intervention, it is essential that a whole child approach to learning support be followed. This simply indicates to us that when we teach the child, we need to teach the child in totality. We need not focus on the parts of the child, but we must teach the child as a whole. So, developing your practice theory, we're saying as a postgraduate students, you are encouraged to reflect on the range of theoretical perspectives above and consider which theory or theories you will apply to your teaching. Therefore, read chapter 2 of the Indigenous African Theories in Multicultural Education that is available on the e-reserves. And as you read, pay attention to the key principles on which the theory is based and the implications of the theory for teaching practice. And self-assessment, as you read, you must as well assess yourself. And you can do that by completing the following table. We have got the theory, that is the critical disability theory, the human rights theory, the inclusive pedagogy, the capability approach, as well as the indigenous knowledge system and African pedagogy. Each theory has got its own implications, and then you need to indicate how you will apply the principles in your inclusive classroom as a postgraduate student. In conclusion, we're saying in this learning unit, we focused on a number of theoretical frameworks that are related to inclusive education. We also examined the key principles of each theory and how they could be translated into practice in inclusive settings. We also introduced you to the concept of a practice theory to stimulate your thinking about how these theories could be implemented in practice. And this marks the end of our presentation for the day. And thank you very much. Good luck.